College football nerds here talking Ole Miss and Alabama. Better late than never. Josh has been feeling under the weather. He's going to try to make it through this one with us because we couldn't go a whole week without seeing y'all's pretty faces. Josh, everybody's here to hear about the train wreck that is Alabama this year. Pete Golding, Bill O'Brien, pile on. We're going to get to that. But first, let's talk Ole Miss. They've lost one game this year. They're 8-1, and nobody's talking about them. They were top 10. They had the one loss. They're still number 11 in the country, and I know the first thing you're going to say is they ain't played nobody, Paul. But with everybody else having not played anybody, it feels like, in the country so far this year, a lot of light schedules, a lot of Power 5 teams not playing Power 5 out of conference. We got Oregon outside of UCLA. Their wins, their average opponent was 3-6. So I'm going to challenge you, Josh, to be a little positive on Ole Miss out the gate and talk about how, what you've seen so far this year, how they might stress Alabama. Let's get into it.
I think the biggest thing you can credit Ole Miss with this year is they've made the most they could out of the pieces that they have. So they went to the transfer portal. In many ways, probably did the best job of anybody in the transfer portal of trying to line up guys that fit their needs. Dart at quarterback has been more than serviceable. And then, you get a bunch of other guys really just across the board, but the most notable of which is probably Zach Evans at running back. Now, he's not even really the leading rusher, right? Quinshon Judkins is the leading rusher on the team. And for a guy that wasn't very highly recruited, he's been extremely successful. Evans does actually have slightly higher yard per carry average, but the volume has generally gone to Judkins. And I think the thing that impresses me the most about Ole Miss is I think they know who they are and they play to it. If you look at their statistics week to week, the main thing that jumps out at me is how much they've relied on the run in games where they really need to sort of pull out a win, and how they know, that they have an effective passing game, but it's not over the top effective. They are yet to have a game where they throw 35 passes. The biggest number they hit was 34 in the LSU game. About 8.3 yards per. In their real SEC games, the ones where they've really been a stretch, they're hovering between about 6.5 to right up to 8.5 yards per attempt, which is just sort of, again, in the competent range, as we usually put it. Anything above 8.5 is when you're overly good. They have a hard time crossing that threshold against high-level teams, but it doesn't really matter because the run game has been so good. In the Texas A&M game, they put up 390 yards rushing. But the big thing I would note is really not the total yardage number. And again, we're not a total yardage channel. It's the averages and the volume. So they ran the ball 63 times, about 6.2 yards per carry. It's a little difficult to hold that kind of an average over that many carries, but they just kind of kept at it. And they only scored 31 points in the game despite having, several hundred yards of offense. But by continuing to lean on the run, they kept the game going. They kept moving the ball. They kept field position, and they continued to accrue points at a good clip. And that really was the key. And the other thing I would say is Ole Miss has continually been in all these games. Even the LSU game that ended up being a blowout, it wasn't a blowout to start the fourth quarter. I believe it was 20-24, to start the fourth. And so really every game this year, Ole Miss has been sort of on top of things. They haven't really been, frankly, dominant a lot of times, but I don't necessarily hold that against them either. I think, again, it really just speaks to who they are, the way they're approaching things. They know they have some good pieces. They know they have a good running game. They've schemed things to balance it effectively with Dart. They're not asking him to do too much. And they've just turned out to be a good football team. I think if you were to try to look at all the individual pieces, right? They maybe aren't as good, and this is probably sort of foreshadows something we'll talk about later. If you flipped rosters and you gave Ole Miss Alabama's roster and Alabama Ole Miss's roster, Ole Miss would be like the number one team in the country, I think, bar none. Like, I think their coaching staff has done a much better job with who they have. I think their schemes are better. They've been a lot more willing to rely on the run. They frankly are just coaching a lot better than Nick Saban's unit right now. Kiffin's team is a better coach team than Nick Saban's team. But at some level, it really comes down to the fact that you're maximizing a roster. But the fact that you're maximizing the roster does mean you have to understand that there are limits to the roster. And so how you evaluate Ole Miss really comes down to how you want to take that.
Yeah, and I like that you pointed out the LSU game being close, and that might speak to where my head goes in terms of a prediction, because LSU, A&M, both of those games started to get away from them a little bit late, and that might speak to depth, which speaks to the roster. Like, they're doing everything they can with this roster, but at some point they don't have the depth to keep up with teams that do have some depth. And it's not any coincidence that they gave up points 2 games on the road against teams that have recruited really well and that are deep on both sides of the ball. A&M is an interesting, juxtaposition there because they have a ton of talent and they are kind of 5-star city now, and they're not doing much at all with it. So that's pretty interesting. But Josh, I think that does also kind of segue us into Alabama, and you've got some offensive statistics that you're going to throw at everybody, and they're shocking, and kids might need to leave the room because it's a little scary. But defensively is what I want to touch on first, and then you can roll into offensive numbers. I put a stat out earlier this week that showed Alabama currently ranks 127th in forced turnovers. I think 120th or something in interceptions, which fumbles. That fumble recoveries is a bit of a random statistic, but interceptions is not. And turnovers in general, there is some luck there, but if you look at 127th versus the last 15 years at Alabama, there's only every year they're in the 20s and 30s, some teens, and then 127th. They have
right. Yeah, turnover luck is whether or not you recover a fumble is generally a random element. The fact that you're forcing fumbles is not. And whether or not pass breakups turn into interceptions is a little bit of a random element. But the fact that you're not getting pass breakups or you're not having any interceptions is not. So it's not within the realm of what I would call turnover luck.
It speaks to the inability of Alabama's defense to dictate a game, to have any kind of game control, to have any ability to make the offense uncomfortable. When I watch Alabama play this year, they might win and they might put up good numbers on both sides of the ball, but they are dictated to by the opposing offense. They don't force a lot of 3 and outs, which puts their offense in a bad spot. The high line of that statistic was Alabama starts more 5-star players than they have gotten turnovers this year, which is insane to me. They forced 6 turnovers this year. Josh, maybe you want to touch on the defense, maybe you want to dive right into the offensive numbers, but either way, the floor is yours to talk about some concerning trends for Alabama football.
So, there's a lot of things defensively and offensively that went into this game. One of the big things is that Alabama really ran some weird schemes in personnel, and a lot of people are aware that they've been doing a 2-4-5. It actually went beyond that. At certain points in the game, they were only playing with one defensive lineman on the field, really in crucial downs. Now, we're probably going to spin that into a different video, so I encourage you guys to check that out. We'll actually show what Alabama was doing, and a rare thing for us, we're actually going to throw some actual game clips up there so you guys can see it. But you get an idea of how bizarre Alabama's scheme has really gotten. But suffice to say, in the LSU game, they handled business pretty well up until key drives. And I think, as that video is going to show, it was really the way that Alabama chose to attack things schematically, how light they chose to be at certain times, that allowed LSU to have key runs in key situations, even in a game where LSU wasn't passing the ball very effectively. And then offensively, there were some stats here that are kind of interesting and also problematic. I mean, Alabama, and again, for most of our statistics, we throw out FCS data, but Alabama's second in the country in yards per carry. But they're 84th in the country in rush attempts. And it's just kind of baffling because Alabama's only 44th in the country in yards per attempt. They have not been an overly effective passing team. And you can talk about Milroe playing. You can talk about the fact that Bryce has been hurt, whatever. That is a part of who they are, right? And even despite that, even despite all those games where you would think they would do nothing but run the ball, they still haven't run the ball very much. And I think that, in a nutshell, really sort of answers a lot of questions from Alabama. And if you want an example specific to the LSU game, they opened the game with a scripted drive that was fairly well balanced, pass to run, some design throws to the backs. They get all the way down to the goal line, and on second down, they throw what is trying to make a hero play. They throw a bad interception, right? But they drove down the field pretty effectively. Now, those first drives are always scripted, so they plan those out. That's not really on the coordinator in the moment. That's just something that the whole coaching staff sort of sets out in advance, and they script and run. After that drive, for the remainder of the first half, Alabama called 27 plays, 22 passes to just 5 runs. And in fact, in the entire first half of the LSU game, Alabama ran the ball outside the red zone 4 times. One was a holding call that was brought back, and that was one of those times they were stopped in the really in their own red zone. The other 3 times, they averaged over 8 yards a carry, but they're the only times they did it. So there is a major balance issue, too, with Alabama, and I really feel like I've been saying this all year. I can't help but think if Alabama ran the ball more, they'd be more successful. And yeah, they have a lot of 2 and 3 yard carries where they get some stuffs, but they have smaller backs that are very explosive. And the thing with a guy like Gibbs is you're either going to tackle him at the line of scrimmage or he's going to bust for a big play. And I think maybe you can talk about this a little bit, Daniel, too. The thing with Alabama in particular, I think, offensively, is that teams have been attacking them a certain way. They've been very aggressive. And that, I think, lends you into this false feeling as a coordinator, and I think this has been O'Brien's fault, into thinking, yeah, I can't run the ball because they're attacking the line of scrimmage. But the thing is, there's nobody behind that attack. So if you pop off a big play, it can be an explosive. And their explosive plays have come far more often through runs than passes. So if you're not throwing the ball well, you're better off keep trying to peg at those run plays, keep testing the defense inside and outside, because when you pop off a big run, which, by the way, is how Alabama scored late, it was big runs that helped them win that game against LSU, then you can get an advantage. But for some reason, Alabama seems unwilling to admit their deficiencies and problems on the offensive side of the ball and unwilling to recognize what I think are maybe ways people are attacking Bryce Young and how they need to adjust offensively to deal with it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that their longest pass play this year was to a running back, 65-yarder to Jace McClellan last week. And they don't really throw to their backs very much. They don't throw to them to replace blitzers. Gibbs has been open all year. The only consistent throw they do to the backs is that little smash Texas route out of the backfield that's been hugely successful. It's been the most successful thing in their passing offense. And then, like you said, a lot of their running has been far more explosive than their passing. The offense is pretty frustrating in general if you're an Alabama fan. Like, even if you're not, just to see a coach sort of mishandle what's just a Cadillac, and he's just leaving it parked in the garage. Josh, we talked about the defense a little bit. Is this a situation where, if we're talking about a path for Ole Miss to a victory in this game, is this a situation where you think their running backs are going to have a pretty successful day? Because I keep thinking I see Alabama's issues in games, and it seems pretty obvious to me. And I'm like, okay, well, they're going to correct that next week. And it's been like that for kind of 2 years. So what you showed with these light fronts and where they're susceptible to the run, that's something that Lane Kiffin, I think it was 2020, that he exploited their inability to stop the run over and over and over again. And we've seen Alabama not be able to adjust at halftime. Is this an area where if you were game planning for Alabama this year, you would kind of not even focus or try to pass too much, and you would just try to hammer them home with the running backs and shorten the game and try to win on 4 yards of carry?
Yeah, I think that's the truth of it. It's an interesting situation when you look at how you attack Alabama and the pieces that Ole Miss has. Most of the time when you're dealing with Alabama in a roster that I think is actually a very good roster that they have this year, you try to find ways to get an advantage, right? You can't be too boring or vanilla. You can't play scared of Alabama, because if you try to not lose the game, Alabama's just going to win it. You have to go and attack, and you've got to be aggressive. And the biggest thing with like that Brian Kelly game at LSU, the reason that I think we've talked about it in the offseason, we think Kelly was a home run hire for LSU in terms of what he is personality-wise versus what LSU needs. But the reason I think may not have that much high-level success is he's too conservative. And they kind of played for Alabama to give him the game. Well, this is the rare Alabama team that will give you the game if you hold it out. And I think the smartest thing for Kiffin to do is to know that he's got good backs, and he has multiple of them, and just play complementary football with your backs. Keep trying to run the ball. Keep pounding. Take points when they come. When they don't come, you can take some chances on fourth down deep in their territory, but just keep them pinned, because Alabama has been awful when pinned deep into their own territory. And so, yeah, it's a strange situation. I talked about before, honestly, from a roster perspective, Alabama's way ahead of Ole Miss. but due to the way the players are actually playing, the schemes they're implementing, the way they're coached, Ole Miss starts to pull relatively even. And, we can start to lead into the model now. I think this does reflect a little bit into the point spread. It's 11.5 last I looked. And I talk about this a lot, right? When you talk about point spreads, it's kind of the median or the average number. But what it doesn't necessarily tell you is just because a team is favored by 11.5, does that mean that they're going to always win by 11? Or does it mean it's a 50-50 shot whether Alabama wins by 20 or loses? And I think this is more the latter. The question that you're asking here is Alabama going to do something to beat themselves? And is Ole Miss going to do enough stuff right to let Alabama beat themselves? And I think that's where Kiffin has an ability to exploit Alabama, because thus far this year and through last year, as you said, they have not done a good job at Alabama of fixing the things that were broken, of realizing the holes in their scheme, of taking things week to week. I mean, we missed the LSU result. I don't feel too bad about it, really, because one, I thought Bryce Young, and you can talk about this too, he had about a dozen uncatchable balls in the first half. I think he's just hurt. Like, the ball's not coming out of his hand right. There's not nearly as much velocity. I mean, when I went back and watched that game, it was kind of striking that there were like 3 and outs where he threw 10 passes. Only 2 of them were in the catch radius of a receiver. But they never adjusted to that and ran the ball. And so I didn't see it coming with Bryce Young, but they should have. They were there in practice. And that's the kind of thing that I think gives Ole Miss a real shot to win this, because, it doesn't matter that you don't have as many 5 stars as Alabama. If your 3 stars play within their scheme the way they need to play, you always have a chance to win. And I think that's the situation Ole Miss is in.
Yeah, I think that, I think I picked Alabama to win that game by 7. I said Alabama road woes are probably going to continue. They were worse than I thought. I'm curious. So I'm going to lead you into the model here, but I want you to sort of maybe go a little faster through the model, but break down a little bit how the numbers kind of indicate that whole might lose the game, could win by 20 scenario, and maybe it shows itself in the data.
Yeah, so the model is admittedly pretty lopsided in a lot of ways. It has Alabama by about 14 points. It's 32-18. Alabama is 7 yards per play predicted to Ole Miss getting about 4.79. I think the things that really stand out to you is Alabama's defensive statistics are still a lot better. Ole Miss is giving up 108% of opponent rushing averages, 99% of opponent passing averages. Alabama is still holding teams to about 68%, 76%. And a big key there is that LSU is a really good football team. And giving up 24 points in regulation to LSU is a really good outing. So there's not really a whole lot statistically to say that Alabama's defense is poor. The problem is that Alabama's points outputted isn't always consistently that high. And, I think you see the sort of spread numbers here. I'll say Alabama had a significant advantage, though, in the model, again, last week against LSU. So the model may be saying, yeah, this is what it thinks to be like the most likely outcome, if both teams play their B-plus game. The problem is that Alabama's variance has been very high, to use a stat we call sometimes. The other problem, really, I would just want to flag for Ole Miss, because I think we're remiss if we don't say this. The harsh reality is that Ole Miss's competition has not been very good. Out of conference, they played Troy, Central Arkansas, Georgia Tech, and Tulsa. The Troy game was 28-10. Tulsa game was 35-27, one score game, and it's not a total fluke. That was a game that Ole Miss could not put away. The crossers were Kentucky and Vanderbilt. You only beat Kentucky by 3. You beat Texas A&M, who's not a very good team, by 3. Auburn, who's not a particularly good team, by 14, and Auburn ran the ball very successfully and get blown up by LSU. You still have to play Alabama, Arkansas, and Mississippi State. So the reality here is, if you believe Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi State, LSU, and are, along with Ole Miss, the top teams in the West, if Ole Miss loses to every SEC West team that's better than them, they could very conceivably finish 8-4 and lose the remaining 3 games, because they're probably playing the 3 best SEC opponents outside LSU, and by far the 3 best opponents on their schedule, really, from this point on. And so I think that's the other thing that the model's seeing. That's probably why the point spread is the way it is Ole Miss has kind of consistently played up and down to their competition, but the competition has been low enough that it just doesn't look that great statistically. And so from at least a modeling perspective, Ole Miss is a more consistent version of something like a Kentucky. And that means you need a little bit of help from Alabama if you want to win, at least in the view of the computers that's just looking at numbers.
So I'm ready to give my pick on this one. Look, we overreact. The media overreacts. The fans overreact. I don't know what we are, but we overreact too. There's been calls for the end of the dynasty. And look, if Saban doesn't fire coordinators, I think that, Alabama might be looking at that. But for now, I also know this, Josh. We're talking about an Alabama team that they're not going to play for national championship this year, but they're literally 2 plays away from being undefeated, having beaten 2 top 10 teams. They played 2 top 10 teams on the road and lost on the last play of the game on both of them. And to me, those are L's in the loss column. They get a 1 for each of those, which knocks them out of contention. That doesn't change the quality of the team. So, if we compare that, I know transitive property doesn't work, but if we compare that to an Ole Miss that played that same LSU team and was close going in the fourth quarter, but it was a pretty sizable margin at the end, and struggled with an A&M team that Alabama struggled with without Bryce Young, I think these teams are a little bit apart, and I think that Alabama will adjust a little bit. If this LSU game didn't happen, if Ole Miss happened before LSU, I think Lane Kiffin might have exploited some things that defensively Alabama's kind of figured out. But I also think in the back of my mind that Bryce Young might still be hurt and might not be 100%. And what happens if that's the case? But still, I'm going to give Alabama the win here. But I don't know that I agree with the model. Give me 31-24 Alabama. What you got?
Yeah, I'm going to go with 31-27 Alabama. A lot of the same thoughts. I mean, at some point, you have to accept that Alabama playing poorly on the road is just a thing. I think Ole Miss is going to be plenty motivated for this game. I do think if Alabama actually leans on the run, they can be successful, and over time it would pay off. I mean, if you look at where Ole Miss has gotten their best statistics, like tackles for loss, right? Coleman leads the team, but your next 2 guys are Tennyson and Reese. You got 2 safeties as top 3 tackle for loss guy, and that's, it's great, but if you've got safeties leading that category, that means you have to bring a blitz and you're being very aggressive in order to get in the backfield. And if you're doing that, you're leaving yourself exposed to plays on the back end and explosive plays from the running backs. Again, you want to if you keep pounding the ball, even if you're getting 2 or 3 yards of carry, eventually you're going to pop one. And if Gibbs gets through, he's probably going to score. And eventually the momentum would take Alabama to win. The question is, do you actually buy that Alabama's going to do that? Are they going to try to stubbornly stick to whatever their scheme is? And I'm not even really sure I could describe it at this point. And then just kind of watch themselves flail for a quarter or 2 that has been their tendency until they wake up, realize they got a need to score and sort of try to create something magically. Because there's just not a lot of built-in ways to consistently win. So I do think Alabama is likely to win this game. But I also think this is a game that is equally likely to be a blowout for Alabama if things go their way and they can run away from it in the 4th. And if Alabama comes out and plays poorly, they're unmotivated, the scheme is bad, absolutely can lose this game. Alabama, if they played up to their potential, and I know Pate said this early in the year, I really think Alabama probably has the most complete roster in college football. So it's not a ding on Ole Miss to say that, yeah, if Alabama plays up to their standard, they should win by a lot. The thing is that Alabama hasn't played anywhere near to their standard. They should be a 20-point favorite over most teams in the SEC this year based on their roster, and they don't play anywhere near that level as a team. It's just the reality of it. But if you're Ole Miss, you should try to capitalize on that situation. You win this game, you sit there with 1 loss. You're sitting behind LSU, but I think this is something a lot of people forget, that, yeah, LSU took the lead away from Alabama, who now has 2 conference losses, and they've got the inside track. But if LSU drops another game, and they drop to 2 conference losses, and Ole Miss wins this game, Ole Miss is in the driver's seat for the SEC West. And I think, the odds of LSU dropping one of their remaining games, I think they have Arkansas and Texas A&M remaining, decently good. I'm not saying it's likely even, but it's a pretty good shot they do drop one of those two. It's hard to win consistently in the SEC. So Ole Miss has a lot of things in front of them, and this is really a big game to win because after this, things, at least from a talent perspective, they're not going to really be in this sort of a deficiency again.
All right, well, that's it for us for Ole Miss and Alabama. Let us know in the comments two things. One, your score prediction. And two, do you think Alabama's going to do the thing where they disappear for 2 quarters, have 3 or 4 or 5 3-and-outs in a row, like they did at Texas, like they did at LSU, Auburn last year, I think Texas A&M last year, Florida last year. So it is a thing. Josh is right. Road Alabama is a thing. Let us know what you think about that in the comments. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. Check out our defensive weirdness for Alabama video later on. And God bless.